kick off this year with something good, as opposed to the terrible circumstances that continue. And yes, super happy to welcome obviously Rebecca, part of NCCR, and also Amal El-Mohtar, who's going to talk this afternoon about her writing. So Rebecca is part of the H&L department and obviously focuses on crime fiction and Gothic and children's fiction, as well as other work on poetry and geography. Amal's come to speak to us today, and she is an award-winning writer of fiction, poetry and criticism. She writes the science fiction and fantasy column for the New York Times Book Review, and she's received several honours, including the Hugo, the Nebula, the Locus and the Aurora Awards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rebecca to kick off the Q&A. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you everybody for being here. Did we just have somebody new in the waiting room, by the way? So Amal and I first met about 10 years ago when we were in Cornwall doing our PhDs. And not to sort of sound too lifetime award achievement winner kind of thing, because obviously your career is not at all at the point where it's over and you're receiving retrospective honours. I do think a lot has changed, perhaps, or developed in the last 10 years that you might have a unique and interesting insight into, especially in the fields of science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, however you might want to define these. And I'd be interested to know how you define these. But if you'd like to sort of start off by introducing yourself a bit further and saying sort of where you come from and kind of how you see yourself within the field and how you see the field, really.
Oh, sure.
Tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I'm just going to, I can't actually let slide the fact that we met 10 years ago. That it's super weird because I don't even know from what point to object to that. Like, on the one hand, I want to say, was it really that long ago? And on the other hand, I want to say, was it only what? So it just, time is particularly slippery. So yeah, when cast my mind back, if we did in fact meet in, was it 2000? It was 2010,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So even slightly more. You know, at that point actually is it's interesting to cast my mind back there, because that was the point at which I had just started selling short stories professionally. So I consider myself part of, you know, the science fiction fantasy community, but that's a very diffuse and slippery term that encompasses a huge range of interests and literatures, and I really think that when I'm thinking about it, I'm not so much thinking about you know, fine-grained distinctions and what is the difference between science fiction and fantasy versus domestic realism and what have you, so much as I'm thinking of the work created by the people who I encounter at science fiction fantasy conventions and have conversations with, sort of, I think, very comparably to the way that that academic conversations happen within the realm of, you know, a given period of inquiry. So, like, you know, you could perhaps talk about the British Romanticist community or the broader Romantic community and stuff. And this is significant to me because I am also an academic, and like my area of interest is British Romanticism and fairies and liminality and affect and stuff like that. So it's sort of, I always feel this sort of slight irritation or allergy towards the establishing of boundaries in genres and literatures versus the exploding or deconstructing of them. So one thing that I tend to say to my students a lot is that from my perspective, you know, all literature is fantasy first, and then everything is a subgenre of that. So domestic realism, subgenre of fantasy, and I do have a rationale for it, but I probably won't belabor it right now. But all this to say that I see myself as having been part of a community of creators who have been talking together about the fiction that they grew up reading, the fiction that they are writing, the fiction that they are reading in their adulthoods, and the overlaps in between those influence a lot. And I think they also intersect a great deal with conversations about diversity, which is a word that is increasingly impossible to say without an inflection of irony, but that nevertheless is useful in talking about like breadth and depth, I guess, a little bit. But definitely over the last 10 years, I've seen conversations that I first encountered in the realm of science fiction fantasy sort of reiterate and replicate themselves in both other communities, other sort of media communities like games and comics, but then also very distressingly and weirdly within politics. So it's weird to kind of see the imaginative center of things kind of refract itself in the wider world in this way. I'm also going to pause for a second to say that I am sort of on very little sleep, and so I'm worried that I'm just going to start rambling. And there always comes a point where I've heard my voice for too long, so I'm just going to stop talking and hope that I answered your question in some regard.
Absolutely, thank you. And before I show a slide of your early years, because I have, of course, followed your career with interest, if not in a creepy way, but with interest for the last 10 years, then could you maybe kind of, just so everybody knows kind of a bit more about your heritage and your kind of background, and so, you know, you sound Canadian, but
yes,
and
indeed,
really.
Yes, so I am Canadian. I was born in Canada. My family is from Lebanon and Syria. So I grew up, it's weird. I've grown up at like this kind of constant intersection of languages and competing identities. So in Canada, I grew up in Quebec on the border with Ontario. So I grew up speaking English, French, and Arabic, but was also kind of always aware that there was this tension between those things, and like lived through a referendum in Quebec, and then lived for a while in Lebanon, which has its own sort of identitarian tensions with Syria, and then lived in Cornwall, which has its own language fault lines with and identity fault lines and stuff like that with England, and then lived in Scotland and had another referendum to live through there, which I actually ironically got to vote in and stuff, unlike the one in Quebec, which I was too young for. So I've moved around a fair bit. My accent is very weird and wandery depending on who I talk to as a consequence. I'm like uncomfortably aware of it as we're talking right now. But yeah, so that is broadly speaking my background. And I'm now married to a Scot as well. So I feel like there's always this, I don't know, I maintain this connection in this way with like family in the UK now and stuff, that, so I feel like I have sort of triangulated identity between a few continents and languages and stuff like that.
And you mentioned the sort of books that people read in their childhoods. What sort of things did you grow up reading, and how do you think your kind of adult work is responding to that?
Absolutely. I grew up reading basically everything with pages, but like literally in our, like I loved reading so much, and if a book was fat, I wanted to read it more, because it seemed like if it was bigger, it must have more secrets in it. But my earliest reading was probably like Random House books of fairy tales and stuff like that. Lots of compendia of stories which never listed an author, interestingly enough. It's only kind of hitting me now. There's a lot of reading of stories and a very little awareness of authorship. And the fairy tales that I was reading were all, you know, European fairy tales as well. I remember at some point reading the Arabian Nights, and and feeling slightly confused by the fact that like the register of the language that I was reading was a sort of deliberately archaic English, and but it was stuff that I was aware of in Arabic, or like my dad would pronounce the name of Sinbad differently in Arabic than the one that I was reading, and like those little weird differences struck me. And but so I grew up reading and loving fairy tales and folklore, and then when I lived in Lebanon, I did this thing which, when I describe it, it makes me sound incredibly precocious, but we lived in Beirut, and we lived in an apartment building, and down the hall there was this lovely old woman named Madame Beiruti, actually, and she had a complete collection of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And one day, and she would just like let me, I was like 7, she would like let me wander in and just read the big fat books, which I was just doing in a very haphazard way. And one day I genuinely don't know how this came about, but I pulled out the M volume, and came upon the mythology entry, and I was like, oh, this is cool. And then in the mythology entry, there was an alphabetized list of a whole bunch of names of people in mythology. So I just kept that volume open and proceeded to very programmatically pull down every other volume that like, so I was like, oh, who is Alceus? I know, I will look this up. And then it just kind of acquired a weird patchwork sense of like mostly Greek mythology from that. But I loved it. It was tons of stories. And I started to like make up stories in my head about like interacting with these gods who were clearly just wacky characters and stuff. But I also read The Hobbit by Tolkien, obviously, and it became my favorite book and has remained so for the whole of my life. And a big part of that was the songs and the riddles and things that I could memorize. But it's always kind of stayed with me that like a lot of the things that I think of as foundational to my core identity as like a nerd, and oh right, I also discovered Doctor Who while in Lebanon. And when I say discovered, I mean I read the novelizations by Terrance Dicks, and I didn't know it was a TV show, and I maintained this ignorance literally up until the reboot with Christopher Eccleston, at which point I was really excited and said to all my friends, I can't even believe it. They're making my childhood books into a TV show. Like, can you even? And they were very sweet and did not laugh at me too much. So, but I loved those books. Like anyway, so I encountered like my first nerdy fandoms and The Hobbit, which like shaped so much of my life, and sort of research into mythology, I guess, like in Lebanon, in this like tiny apartment in Beirut and stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen now. So I think it's all gone weird. So your early work absolutely kind of shows this kind of interest in folklore, fairy tales, and so on. You ran a quarterly speculative poetry journal called Goblin Fruit many years with a couple of friends, right? And yeah, you also published The Honey Month. And then around when we met, you were publishing poetry all over the place.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a bit more about poetry and how and where it came from and where you placed it? And
yeah,
is that still something you're interested in? Is that still something that
very much so
exists alongside the prose?
So also when I was in Lebanon, when I was 7, there was some school assignment or something that required us to write a poem, and I so I wrote a poem, and my parents got very excited because my grandfather, had been a poet and also a revolutionary who had spent a lot of most of my father's childhood sort of in and out of being imprisoned for his politics and stuff. So my parents were very excited in what they saw as, you know, me setting my feet on this path and this vocation. And they made me feel that. They made me feel that poetry was something alive and important and a responsibility and a calling, and that it was something that was still very vibrant, you know, very much part of culture. And it was something that I felt a lot while I was in Lebanon in particular, because sometimes sometimes I'd be out somewhere and someone would learn my surname, and especially I'd be out with my mom, and I'd hear people asking like, "Oh, El-Mohtar, how are you? Are you related to Ajaj El-Mohtar?" And it would come out that he was my grandfather, and they would just kind of nod and say he was a very good poet, in this very solemn way that no one ever mentioned that, like, oh yes, you know, his also revolutionary politics, imprisoned and stuff, but they didn't need to, because it was sort of the same thing. Like, the idea that you were a poet was something that was dangerous, and something that was threatening, and came with this whole sense of speaking truth to power and stuff. So I was really given that sense of it, you know, even though I wrote like a silly poem to the moon, you know. So it's always been with me. It's always felt like something that's very much rooted in my family history, and something that I am always very, like, it feels very important to kind of bring to you know, Western Anglophone audience, who by and large is introduced to poetry via, like, you know, dusty bones rattling in reliquaries of anthologies and stuff like that, and without any sense of like, why should I read Keats? What does Keats have to say to me about my life and stuff like that? When there's a, you know, the totally separate from the idea that like rap is poetry, or that that there are so many ways of coming to and appreciating poetry. So I feel it's like a mission to make young people in particular interested in and excited about poetry. But Goblin Fruit in particular was a very sort of selfish endeavor at first, because my friend Jessica Wick and I were really interested in writing poetry that was taking up folkloric themes and motifs, and fantasy themes and motifs, and fairy tales and things. And we just didn't know any venues that were publishing that. There were at the time, especially like in the early 2000s, there was this real proliferation, especially online, of very small genre magazines with audiences probably in like the couple of hundreds and stuff like that. And they were into like science fiction poetry, which is such a weird term, like science fiction poetry. Anyway, there was just, and a lot of it was just science poetry, but there was usually some speculative element that kind of made it the other thing. And we weren't super charmed by a lot of the work that we were seeing. So we thought, why don't we build it and perhaps they will come? And so we just decided to, and our friend Oliver Hunter, who's a magnificent artist, decided to be our art director. And we just, you know, with more enthusiasm than sense, started this quarterly journal. And it became amazing in the sense that like it grew very quickly, and just kind of, we kept publishing more and more poems and trying to do more and more weird things with form and stuff. And through Goblin Fruit, I met some of my very dearest friends now. Like, I think on this page, you've got CSE Cooney on there, who, you know, was in my wedding party. And let's see who else, like Sonia Tafe. Neil Graham is an incredible poet, and directed the Clarion West program on the West Coast up until I think just about last year. No, 2019. I say last year because obviously last year didn't really happen. But anyway, but so there's yeah, a lot of the people who I still am very involved with artistically and also in friendship, you know, came out of this project. And then there were things like Stone Telling, which was edited by R.B. Lemberg and Shweta Narayan, was also part of like this kind of, it felt like Goblin Fruit kind of spurred a lot of people who also like wanted to see the kind of poetry that they liked best more. So RB started that journal, and it sort of made me want to write slightly different poetry because its remit was slightly different. And yeah, the Honey Month was a project that came about because of meeting someone at a convention named Danielle Suture, and we kind of just got really excited talking about honey together, and decided we would like do an exchange of our favorite honeys that we had, because we realized we both had a few. I thought like I would send her the 8 honeys that were in my pantry, which seemed like a truly absurd number. And she, as it turned out, ran an occasional restaurant in New York, and had 35 different kinds of honey in her pantry. And I was a little bowled over and overwhelmed and thought, well, I don't have that many honeys, but why don't I send you the ones that I have? And for the balance of them, I'll write you something for each one. So it started this month-long project that I did in February of 2009. Yes, I think 2009. Where every day I would take one of, she'd put each one of them in this tiny, like 0.5 milliliter vial, and labeled it meticulously. It was truly incredible. So I would like look at it and then like sniff it and taste it and record my impressions of it. And then I would write something spontaneous from those impressions. And I was posting them to my live journal from back in the day. And once it was complete, a micro press called Papaveria Press offered to collect them and publish them. And in fact, I'm just going to show you this because it's cool. Yeah. So there's the paperback is what's on the screen, but Elizabeth Yellowboy, who ran Papaveria Press, started it by making these very limited edition, hand-bound, gorgeous books. So this is the Honey Month in that form. And like we got Danielle to provide more honey. So like there were 28 of these made, and each one has a tiny vial of honey with it. And this one is blueberry honey. Anyway, yes. Again,
That is quite an artifact to have. I think it's great. Just to kind of pick up on a couple of things, is starting an online journal as a venue for the kind of things you'd like to read something you'd recommend that writers do, or that kind of early career people do? Is it how was the experience overall? Is there
absolutely
any particular advice you'd give to anybody who'd like to start something like that?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, yes, do it. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. I think as a business thing, don't expect it's going to make you money, I suppose. Jess and I started this knowing that we wanted to pay people for poetry, knowing that we could not pay them more than like $5 a poem. And no, like it was only ever going to cost us money. That was the plan. It was like, this was something that we were going to enjoy doing and enjoy having there. And that's all we wanted from it. And the fact that it actually became sustainable, money-wise, was extraordinary at some point. That was entirely like by donations and stuff like that. But it became unsustainable in terms of me actually managing it. So it's been on hiatus for a few years now. But it was a wonderful experience for a number of reasons. And chief among them, again, very selfishly, is that doing a project like this, if you are a writer who is expecting to send out their own work and experience a lot of rejection, will teach you to not take that rejection personally, because overwhelmingly reading the submissions made us aware of just how many perfectly good poems we just didn't want for a given issue, So being an editor really helps you to look at your own work with a slightly more confident eye, I think, that when you're able to look at someone else's work and say, this is actually great, but it's not for us, you can then look at your own work and say, my work is fine, it's just not for this magazine, you know? And it just kind of, please excuse me, I need to let this cat out.
You can introduce us if you like.
I would, except he hates being picked up.
Okay.
But at least, like, my husband has a technique for picking him up in a way that doesn't bother him, and I just can't manage it. So, bless. Anyway, just for getting better about learning what's involved in someone accepting your own work, I think you learn it really viscerally when you have to read a so-called slush pile. So on that front, it was fantastic. It's been really, really humbling to see, like, even, you know, over a decade later, because we started Goblin Fruit in the spring of 2006, and I was at the end of my master's degree, and I was also very young and had lots of energy and could get by with sleeping only like 4 or 5 hours a night, which I don't recommend doing to anyone. But, you know, it at that time, you know, savor your youth, build a magazine or whatever. It was great. What's been humbling, sorry, is just that people still talk about it, and people still talk about how, you know, their first publication came from there, or that actually, I mean, like Shweta Narayan, who co-founded Stonetelling with R.B. Lemberg, told me that, like, they had, so their pronouns are they, them, just to not be confusing, told me that they had never seen a magazine within our genre that was, you know, run by a woman of color, and that gave them the sense, like a sense of permission that they could also do that, and that was very moving. And there's a certain amount of like visibility that you also get. I mean, when I started going to conventions, I went there not just as a fan, but as like the editor of Goblin Fruit, which, even though, again, like our communities are so small, it's not so much that it was like a statement of power or anything, but a statement of aesthetics. Like, I am the person associated with this magazine of fairy tales and folklore and mythology. So there's a sense of, you know, nailing your colors to a mast in that way. I hesitate to say building a brand because they're such unpleasant words, but definitely, like, you know, stating what your aesthetics are is a way to find people who are also interested in those things, and that is actually more important, I think, than the idea of brand building in a kind of, you know, carving out your niche singular way. The thing that was most wonderful about Goblin Fruit was getting to meet people. Ooh, oh, I love this slide. This is great. Colors.
Thank you. That was my subtle hint that we should. Speaking of kind of aesthetics and the kind of niche, I think when I look at Goblin Fruit, I kind of see, it's the fairy tales, it's the folklore, it's these kind of beautiful illustrations and so on. How do you think your most kind of recent major project, or at least one of your most recent major projects, This Is How You Lose the Time War, fits into that? I remember when you published, it was the one about Neptune, something like that. You had sort of concerns about moving from fairy tale, folklore, fantasy towards science fiction.
Yes.
I'd say you resolved those concerns here. But do you want to say a bit more about kind of crossing that boundary, and then perhaps introduce This Is How You Lose the Time War to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a real insecurity about writing science fiction. I was invited to contribute to a project called Women Destroy Science Fiction, which was a sort of reclamation of the fact that some fool on the internet had stated that literally, like in all earnestness, like women can't write science fiction or something. So Christy Yant, who's a marvelous editor and writer, wanted to launch this anthology through Lightspeed magazine. And so they put out this call to submissions. It was going to be this enormous project that was you know, that got, I think, almost 100 women involved in all of the logistics, but also the stories and the essays and stuff in it. Do I have it here? It might be in Glasgow. Anyway, but the main thing was she invited me to write a story, and I was like, I've never written science fiction. She said, but I really want to see what science fiction you write. And the great thing about it was that she didn't let me not do it. I kept trying to get out of it. I kept trying to say, look, I really don't think I can manage this. I don't want to hold up the project. You should probably move on. And she finally ended up saying to me, like, I just want you to trust that I know what I'm doing when I'm asking you to write me a story. And I ended up writing her something called The Lonely Sea in the Sky, that was about the fact that they had figured out that there were like diamond oceans on Neptune. And it really, you know, opened a sort of floodgate. And I'd been insecure about it because of horrible, you know, internalized misogyny, gender stuff about how you need to have a science degree to write science fiction, which is nonsense. But the cool thing about it, but like, you know, one does not overcome a massive insecurity through the publishing of one short story, even though it is one of the ones I'm most proud of because it was so hard to write. But I found my way to writing it, I think, through still like finding these fault lines where stories could kind of open up into bigger ideas, into ideas about science and stuff. And This Is How You Lose the Time War also has a little bit of that in it. The handsome fellow in the sunglasses at bottom left in this is Max Gladstone. And Max and I met at a convention at ReaderCon in, I think, it's no point, what is time? 2014 probably. And we really hit it off, and we just like wanted to kind of keep talking all the time. And This Is How You Lose the Time War came out of the fact that we wanted to write something together. Like that was the whole impetus of the project, was we liked each other and we liked our work, our respective work sufficiently to want to write something together, to collaborate on something. So all the parameters of the project, in terms of like its length, like we thought, well, we can't write half a novel each because we're both very busy people, but half a novella each, that's probably doable. The fact that there are two characters who have a correspondence came out of the fact that he and I had a correspondence. We'd been building our friendship out of like handwritten letters for about a year by the time we decided to start working on it. Max has a much more science literate background than I do. And I have a much more like, how can I put this? Not ecologically minded, literate thing. I know the names of birds and plants and things in a way that Max doesn't. So we found ourselves at a writing retreat at one of, this is a secret, don't tell this, one of Neil Gaiman's houses in the Midwest in the US. And we sat down in his gazebo across from each other for about 9 days and just wrote it there. And the thing about it was that I was very, again, sort of insecure about the science-y things at first. We had talked about the time war. We talked about, we wanted there to be a war in time. We wanted there to be two sides that were sort of equal and opposite in interesting ways. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty of talking about codes and ciphers and thermodynamics and things like that, I found myself like wanting to not let Max down, and we both sort of felt this and the respective things we were trying to write. And so there was a lot of mutually shoring each other up and also kind of challenging each other to do the next thing, to push a little farther and stuff.
Do you want to say what these different sides are?
Oh yeah, sorry. So there are two sides in the Time War. There is Garden, which is so I should say there are two competing futures essentially that are both unstable and that are trying to be the only future in a kind of multiverse. And the way that they try to assure this is by sending agents up thread, as they call it, to kind of curate and manage the timelines that there are into something that will lead to the future that to either one of those futures, basically. One of them is called Garden, and it's a kind of sentient ecology, hive mind world. And the other is run by the Agency, and it's more of a kind of post-human, transhuman, everyone has been digitally abstracted. So the opposite that we wanted, actually, like, we were trying to get away from like nature versus technology, because it's a false dichotomy, and we've both read Timothy Morton, but we wanted instead to have a sense of one world where consciousness was embedded organically, and another one where consciousness was abstracted digitally. So those are the two broad futures. There are two agents, red and blue. Blue is with Garden and red is with the Agency, who start to, who initially are just kind of foiling each other's plans in a spy versus spy way. So, you want to win this war? Well, I will make you lose this war. And you want to save this person? I will make you not save this person, and so on. But as they do that, they start leaving each other notes and taunts that builds up into a correspondence that becomes more and more intimate as the story goes on, and ends up sort of challenging their ideas of who they are in the war and stuff like that.
And as you can see from some of these pictures, then there's a very kind of active fan culture around it. There's a lot of fan art, a lot of kind of really kind of beautiful and artistic engagement with these different sides and these characters on social media. Do you want to read a bit of it, and then we can open questions out to everybody?
Absolutely. So the thing I should say too is that the way that the book is written is an alternation between someone receiving a letter in a given situation and then the letter itself. So I'm just going to read a tiny bit of the first part. When red wins, she stands alone. Blood slicks her hair. She breathes out steam in the last night of this dying world. That was fun, she thinks, but the thought sours in the framing. It was clean, at least. Climb up time's threads into the past and make sure no one survives this battle to muddle the futures her agency's arranged, the futures in which her agency rules, in which red herself is possible. She's come to knot this strand of history and sear it until it melts. She holds a corpse that was once a man, her hands gloved in its guts, her fingers clutching its alloy spine. She lets go, and the exoskeleton clatters against rock. Crude technology, ancient, bronze to depleted uranium. He never had a chance. That is the point of red. After a mission comes a grand and final silence. Her weapons and armor fold into her like roses at dusk. Once flaps of pseudoskin settle and heal and the programmable matter of her clothing knits back together, red looks, again, something like a woman. She paces the battlefield, seeking, making sure. She has won. Yes, she has won. She is certain she has won, hasn't she? Both armies lie dead. Two great empires broke themselves here, each a reef to the other's hull. That is what she came to do. From their ashes, others will rise, more suited to her agency's ends. And yet, there was another on the field. No groundling like the time-moored corpses mounded by her path, but a real player, someone from the other side. Few of Red's fellow operatives would have sensed that opposing presence. Red knows only because Red is patient, solitary, careful. She studied for this engagement. She modeled it backward and forward in her mind, when ships were not where they were supposed to be, when escape pods that should have been fired did not, when certain fusillades came 30 seconds past their cue, she noticed. Twice is coincidence. 3 times is enemy action. But why? Red has done what she came to do, she thinks, but wars are dense with causes and effects, calculations and strange attractors, and all the more so, wars in time. One spared life might be worth more to the other side than all the blood that stained Red's hands today. A fugitive becomes a queen or a scientist, or worse, a poet. Or her child does, or a smuggler she trades jackets with in some distant spaceport, and all this blood for nothing. Killing gets easier with practice and mechanics and technique. Having killed never does for Red. Her fellow agents do not feel the same, or they hide it better. It is not like Garden's players to meet Red on the same field at the same time. Shadows and sure things are more their style. But there is one who would. Red knows her, though they have never met. Each player has their signature. She recognizes patterns of audacity and risk. Red may be mistaken. She rarely is. Her enemy would relish such a magic trick, twisting to her own ends all Red's grand work of murder. But it's not enough to suspect. Red must find proof. So she wanders the charnel field of victory and seeks the seeds of her defeat. A tremor passes through the soil. Do not call it Earth. The planet dies, crickets chirp. Crickets survive for now among the crashed ships and broken bodies on this crumbling plain. Silver moss devours steel and violet flowers choke the dead guns. If the planet lasted long enough, the vines that sprout from the corpses' mouths would grow berries. It won't, and neither will they. On a span of blasted ground, she finds the letter. It does not belong. Here, there should be bodies mounded between the wrecks of ships that once sailed the stars. Here, there should be the death and dirt and blood of a successful op. There should be moons disintegrating overhead, ships aflame in orbit. There should not be a sheet of cream-colored paper, clean save a single line in a long trailing hand. Burn before reading.
Thank you. Thank you. So, shall we open things up to the floor?
Don't know if I'm supposed to leap back in and chair here. Is that what you would?
You can do.
Yeah. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to shout out. I had a question about rewriting mythology, because I know that was something we were sort of touching on
I have a slide about
earlier. Do you have a slide about that? And I don't know if this is just my kind of misperception or perception. Obviously, we've seen a lot of kind of very mainstream fantasy sort of stuff, you know, hitting vast audiences at the moment. But I suppose I was starting to feel like we were also seeing quite a lot of rewrites of mythology. I'm thinking about kind of, you know, novels like The Silence of the Girls or Circe and so on, as well as Stephen Fry's kind of retellings. And you mentioned Neil Gaiman as well just now. I just wondered if you had any thoughts of that. And I wanted to hear more about your rewritings of Welsh mythology as well, if possible, please.
Absolutely. So there's, I think that, astonishingly to me, because I've been as obsessed with fairy tales and their retellings for so long, I've only, it's the cat again, I'm sorry, ghost cat. Why do you keep coming in? You only want to go out again. But anyway, the door doesn't quite shut all the way either, so I can't keep him out. But yes, I've only just started reading Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber I'm sorry, this is a comedy of errors happening in the background now, but which is like one of the foundational texts, both for retellings of fairy tales in the 20th century, but also for a lot of the authors who I grew up reading more in my teens. So people like Terry Windling, who lives in Devon now, or Midori Snyder, or Holly Black, or Delia Sherman. There's this kind of cadre of women, especially, retelling fairy tales at novel length in particular. Terry Windling was an editor of, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, she sort of is responsible for the existence of a fantasy genre in literature, of fantasy publishing, I should say. When she was an editor at, I think, Ace Books in the 80s, she launched a series called the Fairy Tale series. And so Pamela Dean's Tam Lin and Patricia Reedy's Rose White, Rose Red. Like there are just lots of novel length reimaginings of fairy tales in sort of more realistic settings. I mean, like either like Elizabethan England or I don't know, college campus in the Midwest in the 1970s and stuff like that. So I loved reading those. But the idea of like why people retell fairy tales in general is very interesting to me, because they're a kind of means of writing yourself into the things that you have written, a sense of like remixing the information that we have. So, you know, if you, I don't know, if you grow up watching Disney films and you really feel that, you know, I don't know, Jasmine deserved better than Aladdin, or there's a kind of like fan fiction impulse, I think, in just engaging with these texts and deconstructing them, writing back to them, and writing our own concerns and tensions and interests into them. So for me, in like, I had I have a short story called Seasons of Glass and Iron, which, oh, there it is, yes, on this slide, bottom left, that I was invited to contribute to an anthology called The Starlit Wood, which was literally like contemporary retellings of fairy tales. And I was put in mind of a story I told my niece, Lara West, who at the time was like 7, and we had, oh, I'm so sorry, just please excuse me 1 second. All right, I had lots of video. My niece had asked me while we were on a trip from the Scottish Owl Centre back to Glasgow, and she'd asked me to tell her a fairy tale, and I wanted to tell her one, but I realized that all the fairy tales that I knew and that were kind of crowding my mouth to come out had just awful things happening to women in them all the time, and that like women always were you know, evil stepmothers versus their daughters or their stepdaughters, or just various kinds of not great modelings of things for small girls. And I realized I wanted to tell her a story where you know, where 2 girls had an adventure together. So I found myself thinking of how there are lots of fairy tales with a motif of a woman being forced to walk in iron shoes, and also stories that have a woman sitting on a glass hill. And I thought, oh, you could probably climb a glass hill with iron shoes, you know, that would traction, something. So I told her the story where like a woman walking in iron shoes manages to climb a glass hill, and the 2 girls sit and have a conversation, and they decide to go and have adventures together. And a couple of years later, when I was invited to contribute to the anthology, I thought, I could, you know, probably write that story that I just told her in the car, you know. And I did, and it was very well received, I think, partly because of when it was published, and there was a lot of conversation and anxiety going on about just about the ways in which women don't get to talk to each other in film and television. Like there's this kind of the unbearable strangeness of women having conversations together, that I am sort of half referencing an article that I can't now remember, but maybe Rebecca does at some point. There is an article where somebody actually says that just, it's so rare. I'm not just talking about like the Bechdel-Wallace test of, you know, do 2 named women have a conversation about something other than a man in whatever film, which is more of a diagnostic tool for kind of demonstrating an environment of media than it is about talking about the individual worth of any given thing. But it's very rare to see media and stories that really center women's relationships with each other, that just in all of their messy fullness and pain and frustrations. And while this is only a short story, I mean, the core of it is two women reading each other's stories against their grain, and kind of reflecting on like how the stories that we receive can be damaging if they're not examined and if they're not held up to the light. So I think that retellings of fairy tales are always doing that. They're taking a story and holding it up to the light of the present moment and seeing what shines through, or what you can notice about its topography in this environment that we perhaps didn't at the time. Or even, I mean, there's always a lot of recuperation, I think, in retellings of fairy tales, where the kind of sense of a fairy tale as having some finished, polished form is very illusory, and usually involves having sanded off a lot of the ugliness or like horror or very deliberate, troubling aspects and stuff in order to arrive at something that is more in line with the mainstream narrative. So retellings, I think, are kind of recuperating the power and threat a lot of the time of these stories. So the retellings of Blodaweth that I keep doing, because I'm obsessed with the Mabinogion and have been for a long time, and I cannot get away from the Blodaweth story. I wrote two retellings of it, one called The Truth About Owls and one called Florilegia, or Lies About Flowers. I think they're not actually in relation to each other at all. One of them is a contemporary story about a young girl who starts going to the Scottish Owl Centre in like just outside Glasgow, and forms a relationship with one of the owls there because her life is upsetting. And the other one is actually like a queered retelling of the story itself, set in a kind of more medievalish Wales situation. But both of them are like, yes, what if instead of punishing Blodaweth for choosing her own lover, we celebrated that a little bit? Or but anyway.
Thank you so much. So that's such a good answer. Yeah, I love the idea that it's just all kind of like remixing and talking back, and and kind of writing different selves back into these stories.
Absolutely.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So no silly questions. How do you deal with writer's block? And what is your writing schedule process like? Absolutely. So Mary Robinette Kowal, who is a wonderful writer, the current president of the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers of America, and just a wonderful human being, wrote something a few years ago that was sort of a diagnostic tool, where she said, is it writer's block or is it depression? And it's an important question to ask, I think, because not least because writers and writing are almost always necessarily a very solitary pursuit, and it can be very difficult when you're literally living inside your head all the time to get outside it enough to interrogate why something is difficult at a given point. And these once you have sort of determined for yourself, is it like, can I not write because I'm depressed, or can I not write because of some other factor? Then that will inform how you deal with it. So I guess, I mean, it sort of depends on what you mean by writer's block, but I'm just going to assume, unless you want to elaborate, that it's just, sitting in front of your screen and the words are just not coming, and if that's the case, there are the lots of ways of dealing with that that will kind of all depend on what your usual process is. For me, I tend to be the kind of writer that like percolates for a long time, and then doesn't actually spend a lot of time in front of the screen because I tend to write something that is almost complete within a short period of time after having percolated for a very long time. It's not a great strategy. I actually am very envious of people who are able to write drafts of things, because then you can just revise something and make it better and stuff. And I am more the kind of writer who writes a very polished first draft, but that takes a very long time. Just gonna look at But feeling uninspired, unmotivated to write. So I think so again, like I kind of want to sit with you there, Gemma, and go like, tell me more and stuff, in a way that would be more helpful. But if just thinking about being uninspired, I think that again, there's a lot about our current situation, which is quashing of any kind of creative or joyful impulse. And I think that that obviously is going to impact your writing. And so if there was ever a time to not beat yourself up about not writing, this is one of those times. But I find for myself, the things that have been making me excited to write lately are often things that often involve giving myself permission to be silly, if that makes sense. I often most of the writing that I find myself having done over the last year has been, how can I put this? It's slightly embarrassing. It's just has been in relation to games. Like I really enjoy games. I make games part of my pedagogy. And I love playing games. And a lot of the games that I play, I mean, they will range from, things on Switch to tabletop role-playing games to collaborative storytelling enterprises. And I think that like something I hugely recommend, which just happens to be right in front of me, there's this game called For the Queen, which is genuinely one of the most beautiful, affecting, intimate, wonderful games I've ever experienced. It's by a brilliant woman named Alex Roberts. And it's a collaborative storytelling game where I'm just going to read you the back because it's really cool. The land you live in has been at war for as long as any of you have been alive. The Queen has decided to undertake a long and perilous journey to broker an alliance with a distant power. The Queen has chosen all of you and no one else to be her retinue and accompany her on this journey. She chose you because she knows that you love her. And the way that the gameplay goes is that you have a whole bunch of card prompts that ask you extremely weird questions like, when did the Queen last hurt you? And I don't know, like, the Queen makes you feel beautiful, how? And stuff like that. And you're playing this with like 4 to 6 other people. And so as you're going around answering these questions within this context of you all being on a journey together, you're all sort of inventing a character, and you're all inventing the relationships between your characters. And it's just a tremendously beautiful experience. It's very intimate and can be very harrowing. But I find that if you're feeling uninspired and you're feeling like your creativity is lagging, approaching that creativity from a very slant angle, from something that is kind of going to draw on the same well that you usually draw on to write, but in a completely different context where your senses of permission and failure and success are completely skewed, is something that I find very helpful. So if I sit and play a game of For the Queen, I'm telling stories, I'm engaged in that creative impulse, but I'm not marking it in the same kind of horrible sense of failure that you feel when you're just staring at a blank page, or if there's, I'm not going to talk about this because it's impossible to talk about it, but there is an online phenomenon called Blaseball, which is like an online fantasy baseball kind of thing. And the community around that has also just exploded with fan art and fan writing and fan music. And I have become a participant in that. And so there's like I've written Blaseball songs. I don't even understand how this happens, but it's just, so sometimes I think that just like allowing yourself to channel that creativity into a medium that isn't your professional one, that allows you to have fun, that allows you to just kind of enjoy the thing that you're doing, I think is the path back to letting that come back into your work. I hope that answers the question. So just looking at another question in the chat.
Yeah, so we've got one more in the chat, I think, if you don't mind answering that one, maybe to wrap up. That would be lovely. Thank you.
Great. So do I think that my cultural background has given me advantages as a writer? I don't know about advantages so much as, I mean, it's definitely all over my writing. I think if it's given me any advantage, it's been one of understanding very intimately and kind of viscerally how much empathy is necessary to writing effectively. So, you know, when you live at like intersections of places a lot, and when you sort of experience marginalization from various axes or backgrounds, you get into the habit of, of empathizing with others or understanding others' perspectives. Partly out of self-defense, unfortunately, you know, like needing to understand the ways in which people are going to react to me before, like in ways that I have no control over. If they see my name, if they make assumptions about, you know, my faith or something as a consequence, like understanding that those things are going to happen and knowing how to navigate them is a learned response that you develop, but it is also a kind of facet of empathy, of understanding other people's backgrounds are going to lead them to these activities and thought patterns and stuff, and how to kind of move through that. But also I think that, you know, learning more than one language is a microcosm of all of that, because when you're learning a language, you are also, you know, you're allowing your interiority to be shaped by the enormity of culture and lineage and inheritance that has produced that language and that language contains. And so, like, I think that speaking more than one language absolutely feels like a weird advantage, I guess, or superpower in terms of writing, because if you do speak more than one language, you're probably aware of the fact that your literal physical voice sounds different in the other language, and there are all sorts of like actually researched reasons into why this is, but it also means that you have a different written voice in those languages, and knowing that you can have different voices, different kind of colors and shadings and textures to your voice, I think definitely feeds into the ideas of what goes into writing fiction, and how a story can best be served with like a different voice and stuff like that, even if not necessarily a different language in particular. But yeah, all of that I think feeds into it. I'm often confronted with this feeling of I don't know, like if there's something that actually does stymie me, sometimes it is the thought of never having had the opportunity to learn or speak another language. This weird this weird conversation that was happening on Twitter a while ago with a couple of my friends, where someone I know who has grown up and lived almost exclusively in Kentucky was talking about how he saw it as like this massive privilege to be able to speak another language. And then I was like, oh, that's really interesting, because I, you know, grew up in Quebec, where like there's a necessity of being bilingual, and also my parents are immigrants, and like they're like coming to a place without the language that place speaks and needing to learn it doesn't feel like a privilege at all, you know, or coming with the need to kind of suppress or negotiate or mitigate the languages that you've inherited in a new context doesn't feel like a privilege. But, you know, but these things are both true. You know, someone who doesn't necessarily have access to other communities of language in Kentucky will see like people who speak other languages as a class marker, in a way that someone, you know, speaking 3 languages on the border between Quebec and Ontario from an inherited immigrant background and stuff is not the same thing. And yet, like, they're both windows into these other experiences. So yeah, advantages, not super sure, but that they are definitely all over my writing. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. we should probably draw it to a close, because I'm conscious it's so easy to let Zoom overrun. We've got one more quick question from Gemma. Actually, I'm going to let that one slide. Yeah, what's your favourite game? Seeing as you mentioned it.
Oh gosh. So I would need more parameters, but I will say, so my favorite card-based game is definitely For the Queen. My favorite, you know, kind of more typical video game at the moment is Hades. Which is so good. It's so good. It's just absolutely wonderful, and it plays into the kind of retelling of myth thing. The idea is that you are Zagreus, the son of Hades, and you are trying to break out of Hades to go and find your mother Persephone, who you have never met, and stuff. So there's like all this replaying with Greek mythos, but that clearly did actually have a lot of classicist consultants with. Like there's a lot, it's both very fanficky but very scholarly in some ways, but you are literally just fighting your way out of hell. And the part of the game that I find fascinating is that it's built into the assumption that you are going to fail at fighting your way out of hell at least 60 times before you get out the first time. And it has felt so cathartic for this past year. It's been unbelievably the best thing to play when you are in a lockdown is a game where you keep trying to fight your way out of hell, getting slightly stronger every time, and then finally actually do it. It's amazing. It's an amazing game. You can play it on Switch. I think you can play it on Steam. The other thing that I've been playing a lot of is Animal Crossing. It's just nice. It's just it's the flip side of playing Hades. You know, sometimes you want to battle your way out of hell, and sometimes you want to live on a tropical island and just fish and make snowmen, which you can do on this tropical island for some reason, and have some animal friends who you can hang out with, and it's good. So, yeah.
That's a perfect end point, actually, tying it all back up together with the current context, the ownership of myth, the kind of writing yourself back into the game, controlling the narrative. I love it. Thank you both so very much. Rebecca, thank you for such excellent questions and beautiful slides to kick us off. And Amal, really thank you very much for such an interesting and inspiring talk. Now is the time to use. No, we're really, really happy to. Now is the time to use the applause icon. Yeah, some really great information there on the practicalities of writing and editing and all the demands of different genres and kind of media and so on. So thank you very, very much. Thank you everyone for coming along. It's been lovely to see some faces and see you all. Our next session, these are weekly research seminars, but the next NCCR session is on Wednesday, the 10th of February, where Karina Westling is going to talk to us about immersive reading. And I'll be sending calendar invites and so on around for that. But yeah, thank you very much. I wish everyone a happy, smooth rest of week. May we fight our way out of Hades, and so on.
Thank you, everybody.